7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public. Portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls are here at DC's Museum of the Bible, removing all obscurity and open for all to see. Now, for 70 years, the Dead Sea Scrolls held onto a secret nobody thought to look for. The question everyone asked was always the same. What do these texts say? Generation after generation of scholars were certain it was the only question worth asking. Nobody stopped to ask the other one. What are they made of? Then, in a laboratory at Tel Aviv University, a molecular biologist named Oded Richavi pulled ancient genetic material out of dust collected from a single fragment, ran the sequence, and stopped cold. The animal whose hide had become that piece of parchment could not have been alive anywhere near the cave where it was discovered. Not for a season, not for a single day. And that one impossible result was about to unravel everything scholars believed they understood about the most famous manuscripts on Earth. This is a sample from one of the major scrolls. We have 5 of them, remarkably well preserved considering they came from a cave. To understand why that result mattered so much, you have to go back to where this all began, to a hillside above the Dead Sea and a shepherd who had no idea he was about to change history. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dib tossed a rock into a cave near the shore of the Dead Sea, chasing after a missing goat. He heard something shatter. Curious, he climbed inside and found ancient clay jars sealed for centuries holding leather scrolls wrapped carefully in linen. He had no way of knowing what he'd stumbled onto. Neither did anyone else. Not yet. He was searching for a lost goat. When he reached the mouth of a cave, he tossed a stone inside just to see if the animal might bolt out. What he'd found would become the single most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the oldest biblical manuscripts known to exist, some reaching back more than 2,000 years. By the time the world outside that cave understood what the shepherd had found, the scrolls were already moving. Bedouin traders passed them through a small network of antiquities dealers across Bethlehem and Jerusalem. An Orthodox Christian antiquities collector named Khalil Iskander Shaheen, known in the trade simply as Kondo, bought several of the original 7 scrolls through Mohammed Ed-Dib's cousin and wrapped them in cellophane before mailing them to a professor at Hebrew University in November of 1947. Other fragments surfaced through different hands. A leather dealer sold pieces. A cobbler held some. A Syrian archbishop acquired one for a museum in Beirut. By 1949, 4 of the original 7 had been quietly shuttled to America, where they were purchased and donated to the newly founded Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum. The others stayed in Jordanian-controlled East Jerusalem. For almost 2 decades, access to study the scrolls was tightly restricted to a small circle of European and American scholars. The rest of the world, including most Israeli researchers, was kept at arm's length. The original editorial team, working under a mandate that would later become one of the most bitter disputes in modern biblical scholarship, photographed fragments and refused to share the photographs. Generations of graduate students wrote their dissertations on fragments they had never physically seen, working only from blurred black and white plates distributed in tiny print runs. Researchers who asked for higher resolution images were told to wait. Researchers who published dissenting readings were quietly cut from the next round of access passes. The whole enterprise carried an air less of open science than of a closed workshop guarding a guild secret. Collaboration, when it finally came slowly and grudgingly. It wasn't until 1991 that the Huntington Library agreed to release a complete photographic archive, and even then the release happened in stages spread across years. By the time the full corpus became openly available, an entire generation of potential readers had already retired. The mystery of the texts had been answered, in whatever shape the theology allowed, long before the texts themselves could really be read. Between 1947 and 1956, roughly 25,000 fragments representing close to 1,000 separate manuscripts were pulled from 11 caves near the ruins of Qumran. They contained the earliest known copies of Genesis, Isaiah, and Psalms, alongside sectarian rulebooks, hymns, and visions of apocalypse, texts spanning from around 250 BCE to 68 CE, the single most volatile stretch in the history of both Judaism and the earliest Christian movement. Sealed away in the dry Judean desert, these scrolls had quietly outlived the Second Temple, outlived Rome, outlived every empire that had risen and crumbled across 2,000 years above them. But when scholars finally opened them, the texts didn't hand over easy answers. They handed over questions that would take 7 decades even to begin answering. Where had they come from? Who had written them? Why were they hidden away in this particular corner of the desert? For most of those 70 years, scholars believed they had it figured out. They were wrong. The theory that held for decades pointed to the Essenes, a Jewish sect described by ancient historians like Josephus and Pliny the Elder as a secluded monastic community in the Judean wilderness devoted to purity, scripture copying, and the coming of divine judgment on a corrupted world. The ruins at Qumran, sitting just beside the caves, looked exactly like the kind of settlement Josephus had described centuries earlier. The pieces seemed to fit together almost too well. The sectarian texts described a self-contained religious community with its own leadership, its own laws, and a solar calendar that broke sharply from the lunar calendar kept by the priests in Jerusalem, a direct theological challenge to the establishment at the temple. The apocalyptic writings burned with hostility toward that temple establishment. The War Scroll, describing a final cosmic showdown between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, read exactly like something a breakaway sect would produce to make sense of its own exile from mainstream Jewish life. The conclusion felt airtight. The Essenes lived at Qumran, copied their scripture there, and when Rome crushed the Jewish revolt in 68 CE, they buried their library in the surrounding caves for safekeeping. For decades, that was the accepted story, taught in seminaries, featured in museum exhibitions, repeated in documentary after documentary. The Dead Sea Scrolls were the Essenes' private collection. Case closed. Nothing left to debate. But underneath the surface of that tidy story, uncomfortable details kept quietly surfacing. Details the tools of the time simply weren't equipped to resolve. The scrolls showed wild, almost bewildering textual variation. Different versions of the same biblical book sat side by side. Different scripts, different hands, different levels of skill. Parchment quality ranged from expertly prepared skins to rough, almost amateurish material sitting right beside them in the same cave. When radiocarbon dating was finally applied to a sample of fragments in the early 1990s, some scrolls turned out to predate the Qumran settlement itself. The chronology simply didn't add up the way the theory required, and nobody could explain the deeper puzzle underneath all of it. Why would one isolated, tightly disciplined sect hold onto multiple contradictory versions of its own sacred texts? Why keep two entirely different editions of the Book of Jeremiah, one substantially longer than the other, with whole passages missing and chapters rearranged inside a community supposedly built on rigid religious uniformity? Some scholars floated alternatives at the margins of the field. Maybe Qumran wasn't a monastery at all. Maybe it was a pottery workshop, a winter estate, a military outpost. Maybe the caves functioned as a sacred depository where worn-out texts from many communities were brought to be respectfully retired rather than discarded. These ideas existed, but none carried the hard evidence needed to dethrone a paradigm that had held for generations. Then something arrived from a direction nobody in the field expected. Not an archaeologist, not a theologian, a geneticist over lunch. In 2012, at a table in Tel Aviv University, molecular biologist Oded Rechavi sat down with biblical scholar Noam Mizrahi. The conversation drifted, as conversations between old colleagues often do, toward the Dead Sea Scrolls, toward the maddening difficulty of matching thousands of tiny disconnected fragments, and toward the questions that 70 years of careful scholarship had never managed to close. Mizrahi laid it out plainly: 25,000 fragments, no titles, no page numbers, no reliable way to connect one piece of parchment to another beyond handwriting comparisons and educated guesswork about how old skin looked. Methods that were subjective, imprecise, and capable of being catastrophically wrong without anyone realizing it. Rechavi listened carefully. Then he asked one simple question. What are the scrolls actually made of? Parchment, Mizrahi said. Animal skin? Rechavi paused for a long moment. Parchment has DNA. That single sentence opened an entirely new field of inquiry that nobody had thought to pursue. Rechavi specialized in ancient DNA analysis, a method that had already reshaped the study of human prehistory, tracing migration patterns and population history across tens of thousands of years. In that moment, at that lunch table, he realized nobody had ever pointed that same method at a manuscript, at scripture itself. It turns out this one is cowhide. So, we have two fragments that came back as cowhide. Together with Penina Shore, curator of the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Israel Antiquities Authority, Rechavi and Mizrahi assembled the small team that would spend the next several years chasing something no one had ever attempted before. What they found along the way would unsettle even the people who had spent their entire careers protecting these fragile, irreplaceable texts. Here was the first obstacle, and it was serious. The Dead Sea Scrolls are sacred to multiple faiths and, by definition, entirely irreplaceable. Any method involving cutting, drilling, or removing physical samples was off the table from the start. The scrolls had to stay whole, untouched. So, how do you read the genetic history of something you are absolutely forbidden to touch? The answer had been sitting there the entire time, hiding in plain sight, inside the storage boxes themselves. Decades of careful handling had left behind fine particles of parchment dust, quietly accumulating at the bottom of the containers. That dust held collagen, the structural protein found in animal skin, and locked inside it, preserved across 2,000 years, was ancient genetic material. By gathering dust from blank margins and worn edges, places where no writing had ever existed, the team could collect enough material without ever touching the inked text itself. The evidence had been waiting quietly in that dust the entire time, through every study and every decade of scholarly debate. But turning that dust into usable genetic sequences was brutal work. The very process of making parchment, soaking, scraping, stretching, sizing, drying, damages DNA at a molecular level. The iron-based inks used on many scrolls are chemically corrosive, and after all of that, the scrolls spent 2,000 years in desert caves before being handled by hundreds of researchers over the following 70 years, each one potentially leaving traces of modern contamination. The team worked inside dedicated ancient DNA facilities that resembled clean rooms more than archives. Full protective suits, positive air pressure, ultraviolet sterilization. They built strict authentication protocols to confirm their results were genuinely ancient and not contamination from modern hands, hunting for patterns of molecular decay that only accumulate across centuries, running samples through multiple independent extractions, cross-checking every result between separate laboratories. It took years, hundreds of samples, repeated failure, but eventually they assembled reliable genetic sequences from dozens of fragments. And when Rachavi finally studied what those sequences showed him, he reached for his phone. Most fragments matched expectations without incident. Sheepskin, the standard material used throughout ancient Judea, taken from an animal fully capable of surviving in a harsh desert environment like Qumran. But a handful of fragments came back as something else entirely, something that shouldn't have been possible. Cowhide. Noah Mizrahi stared at that result for a long time. He knew Qumran intimately, the texts, the terrain, the long, difficult history of the site. And he sat with the data in silence before he said anything to anyone. Because cow parchment at Qumran wasn't just an anomaly to be footnoted and set aside, it was physically, geographically impossible. Qumran sits in the Judean desert beside the Dead Sea, one of the harshest, driest environments found anywhere on the planet. Sheep and goats can survive there. They're built for arid land, for minimal water, for tough scrub vegetation that would starve most other livestock. Cattle simply cannot. A single cow needs dozens of gallons of water every day and substantial grazing pasture to survive, let alone thrive. There was no version of a community living at Qumran that could have also raised cattle nearby. Cow parchment simply could not have been produced in that desert, full stop, which meant any scroll written on cowhide had originated somewhere else entirely, somewhere with real water and real grassland. The theory wasn't slightly off, it was wrong. Wrong in a way that one single cow made completely undeniable. The first instinct inside the team was to assume a mistake. They re-ran the extraction. The cow signal came back identical. They pulled dust from a second margin of the same fragment. Cow again. They tested a fragment from the same cave, same stratum, same archaeology shelf, hoping for sheep. Cow. 3 independent extractions, 2 laboratories, the same animal. The team's working hypothesis, internal to their own notes, was that cattle had been brought in from somewhere else and slaughtered near the site. A pilgrimage caravan, perhaps? A trade caravan crossing the desert toward Moab. It was the only natural story that left the cow finding intact and the surrounding dating numbers intact at the same time. Then they pulled mitochondrial DNA from a sheep fragment collected at the same archaeological level. The sheep's lineage mapped to local Levantine breeds. The cow's lineage mapped to breeds documented across northern Mesopotamia along trade routes that ran through Anatolia and down through the Levant's coastal plain. The cow's maternal line, in other words, walked to Qumran along a road that did not pass through Qumran's desert, which left only one interpretation standing. Not a misread, not a footnote anomaly. The scroll itself had traveled. The cowhide had not been raised anywhere near the cave, where that fragment was eventually buried. Whoever brought the hide to Qumran had carried it in from somewhere else, hundreds of miles across weeks of open desert. The parchment was a traveler long before the scroll became one. When that result crossed Nina Shore's desk at the Israel Antiquities Authority, she stopped reading and simply sat with it. She had spent her entire career as custodian of these fragments. She knew the dust in those storage boxes better than most people know the rooms of their own homes. She read the finding twice, slowly, to make sure she understood it correctly. She would later say it felt like the room had tilted beneath her, that this wasn't only a challenge to the Essene theory, but to the entire framework scholars had built for understanding what the Dead Sea Scrolls actually were. And the cowhide wasn't scattered randomly across the collection, which would have been strange enough on its own. It clustered around specific texts, specific versions of specific books, which is exactly where the genetics gets stranger still. By comparing genetic markers across different parchment samples, the team could determine whether separate fragments came from the very same individual animal. 2 pieces of parchment from one sheep carry nearly identical mitochondrial DNA. 2 pieces from different sheep simply don't. For 70 years, matching fragments had relied entirely on guesswork. Now, for the first time, there was hard genetic evidence, actual fingerprints written into the material itself. Take the book of Jeremiah as the clearest example. 2 dramatically different versions of it survive among the scrolls. One resembles the familiar Hebrew Bible read today. longer, with its chapters arranged in the standard expected sequence. The other is noticeably shorter, missing entire sections outright. Its chapters arranged in a completely different order. Before 1947, the earliest Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament available anywhere to scholars dated only to roughly 1000 CE, and for decades after, word experts had debated endlessly over what these divergent versions actually meant. An early draft, perhaps, or a later theological revision, or simply a scribal slip. The DNA finally gave a concrete physical answer to a debate that had run for decades. The shorter version of Jeremiah was written on cowhide. The longer version was written on sheepskin. Different animals entirely, almost certainly different regions. These weren't simply variant copies, slowly drifting apart from one shared original source. They were two genuinely separate textual traditions, developed independently of one another in two separate communities, in two different parts of ancient Judea. Read that again because it matters. Two communities, two Bibles, existing side by side. The team ran the same analysis on the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice, a liturgical text describing angelic worship inside the heavenly temple, with copies found at both Qumran and at Masada, the mountaintop fortress where Jewish rebels made their final stand against Rome in 73 CE. The DNA showed that multiple Qumran fragments of the same text came from entirely different animals. This text, it turned out, was popular, widely copied, and produced independently in multiple places, not the guarded exclusive property of a single isolated sect. Then came the kinship analysis, which added yet another layer to the picture. By examining nuclear DNA markers, researchers could sometimes identify parchments that came from closely related animals, siblings, or members of the very same flock. Clusters of related animals pointed toward specific production centers, places where several scrolls had clearly been made from locally sourced skins around the same narrow window of time. And here's the detail that mattered most. Some of those tightly related clusters, clearly produced together from a single flock, turned up mixed in among fragments with no genetic relationship whatsoever, coming from entirely different animals and entirely different flocks. This wasn't a collection that had grown naturally out of one central scriptorium. It had been gathered together from multiple points of origin, representing multiple communities scattered across the region, spanning multiple decades, quite possibly stretching across whole centuries. The library theory didn't just crack under this weight, it came apart completely. What this meant was not just a tweak to existing theory. It was a complete restructuring of where these texts had come from. If the scrolls had truly originated from one isolated sect living at Qumran, their sheer diversity would make almost no sense at all. Why would a single disciplined community bother preserving competing versions of its own scripture? Why hold on to texts representing theological positions it actively rejected, rather than simply destroying them? But if the collection had instead been gathered from many different communities scattered across ancient Judea, brought together in these caves gradually over decades, and finally sealed away by one catastrophic crisis, suddenly everything falls neatly into place. The diversity isn't a complication that needs explaining away. It's the entire point of the collection. The genetic evidence backed up something a few scholars had long suspected, but could never actually prove. These caves, the very same ones Muhammad ed-Dib's stone broke open back in 1947, had functioned as a geniza, a sacred storage site where Jews from many different communities brought texts too holy to simply destroy, but no longer usable in daily worship. Jewish law forbids discarding any document that bears the divine name. Such texts must instead be respectfully preserved. Ancient communities across the region kept designated spaces called genizot for exactly this purpose. The Cairo Geniza, famously preserved inside a synagogue in Old Cairo and only emptied in the late 19th century, gives us a clear picture of what those depositories actually held. Sacred books past their usable life, ritual objects no longer fit for ceremony, fragments bearing the divine name waiting out the centuries in dry silence until someone eventually came to read them. Now picture the surrounding geography. Jerusalem sits barely 20 miles from Qumran, a manageable journey by ancient standards. Jericho, the oasis town fed by perennial springs, sits even closer with year-round grazing and reliable water. The Jordan Valley, with its seasonal pasture, runs north to south just a few miles to the east. When Rome laid siege to the city between 68 and 70 CE, Jews fleeing that destruction may well have carried whatever sacred scrolls they could rescue out into the desert, adding them to a collection other communities had already been depositing there for generations. Family scrolls, synagogue scrolls, fragments of an entire world being rescued as everything familiar collapsed around them. These caves, then, weren't the private archive of one monastic order living apart from the world. They were a shared sacred library belonging to the whole of ancient Israel, and the cowhide fragments proved something even more specific about how that library came together. The texts were physically traveling between distant regions, carried from wetter, more fertile land to the north or west, into the very heart of the Judean wilderness. This wasn't a closed, inward-facing community guarding its own private truth. It was a living, breathing network of Jewish communities exchanging texts, ideas, and religious practice across real geographic distance. The scrolls are not the private property of one sect at all. They are a portrait of the whole conversation that was going on between communities across Second Temple Judea during the years that immediately preceded the rise of Christianity. What that means for the origins of Christianity is genuinely significant. The world Jesus was born into wasn't one of settled, comfortable theological agreement. It was a landscape of vigorous, geographically scattered religious debate with multiple communities, each convinced they held the authentic tradition. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't the position paper of one single faction inside that larger debate. They captured the entire argument in all its messy, contradictory detail. There was no single universally accepted text of Jeremiah floating above the fray. There were multiple versions, shorter and longer and differently arranged, each one treated as the authoritative form of Scripture by whichever community happened to keep it. The same pattern held true for Genesis, for the Psalms, for the various prophetic books. Canonization wasn't a finished process, handed down from above. It was still actively underway, still contested, still genuinely unsettled. And now the DNA had proven that fact physically, not merely theoretically. Separate communities in separate places were independently maintaining separate versions of what they each called the Bible. The textual tradition wasn't fixed or frozen in place. It was alive, evolving, and it looked meaningfully different depending on exactly where you stood within it. The world in which Jesus taught and in which the earliest Christian movement first took shape was steeped in exactly this kind of diversity. Competing scriptures, competing interpretations of the law, competing visions of what God would do next for his people. And the evidence for all of it had been sitting quietly in dust on a storage shelf the entire time, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. The 2020 publication of this genetic research opened an entirely new chapter in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship, one that's still being written. What it made possible to ask for the very first time may end up mattering even more than what it managed to settle. Before this work began, there was simply no way to scientifically confirm whether two fragments belonged to the same manuscript, whether a given text had originated in one place or many, or whether separate scrolls shared any real physical connection beyond a loose similarity in subject matter. Now, for the first time, there is. Researchers are already chasing new questions. Can they pinpoint specific production centers for individual texts? Can they map out the entire geographic web of Jewish scribal communities that once stretched across ancient Judea? Can they trace, in real physical detail, how textual traditions moved from place to place over the course of decades or even centuries? The team expanding this work is pairing the genetic data with multispectral imaging, capable of recovering writing invisible to the naked eye, and building reference databases of ancient animal DNA drawn from across the ancient Near East. The goal is a geographic map precise enough that a single fragment could reveal roughly where in the ancient world the animal behind its parchment once lived. The work of reading the Dead Sea Scrolls, in other words, isn't finished. In many ways, it's only just now truly starting, and what comes next is going to reshape our picture of Second Temple Judaism down to the way ordinary households understood the words they read in synagogue and recited at home. That single question, what are the scrolls actually made of, dissolved the wall between two fields that had spent almost a century staring at the same artifacts from opposite sides of a window. Textual scholarship had mapped every stroke of every surviving letter. Material science had barely tried. Ancient DNA had never once been pointed at Scripture, anywhere, by anyone, until Rachavi asked the question over a Tel Aviv lunch he did not know would change the history of the Second Temple period. For the field, the ceiling was not technological. The ceiling was an assumption nobody had thought to question. The scrolls are parchment. Parchment is animal skin. Animal skin is tissue. Tissue is biology. Biology is information. That chain had been sitting in plain sight for decades. It was followed only because someone finally noticed it. Imagine what else in the ancient world is sitting in storage boxes waiting for the same question. Imagine what an unknown parchment from Elephantine, or a Herodian palimpsest from the Cairo Geniza, or an unwashed bone fragment from a Masada ossuary would say if someone finally unsealed the dust around it and read what was written there. The Dead Sea Scrolls rewrote the history of how Scripture reached us. The next 7 years of this work are going to rewrite the history of how we read it. The shepherd opened the door. The scientist finally heard what had been waiting patiently behind it.